My first paper on the rise of China I wrote about 5 years ago, and I started to think about this issue by putting China alongside other cases. So what is the category of problem that we're looking at? Power transition. What are the other episodes? What can we learn? How can we situate this among other cases? Louis XIV, Charles V, Napoleon, other post-Bismarck Germany, great cases of power transition. And my first intuition was that it really matters what kind of order exists when a rising state rises. The kind of what is the nature of the greeting committee? What is the nature of the order that exists that this rising state is confronting? Because the tension almost always goes immediately to, well, what does the rising state want? It now has power, it's going to gain more power. In the out years, it's going to be much more powerful. What will it want to do? It will want to, as our great structural theories suggest, want to overturn the old order and create a new order. And I said, in my paper, wait, let's look at the existing order and what kind of constraints and attractions and complexities emerge from thinking about that. And this was in a book edited by Robert Ross and Zhu Feng. And it's in that spirit that I continue to work this problem, and I try to focus on, in my remarks today and in recent papers, the confrontation between China and, we'll call it the liberal international order. I sometimes call it the West, but it's not the West. It's a broader and deeper construction. And because I'm not a China expert, I'm very interested in the outside world, the kind of outside-in kinds of questions, these constraints and opportunities. And from that perspective, the big questions just roll out immediately in front of us. Will China choose to integrate into the existing system or resist and oppose it? Will it be a stakeholder or will it seek to build alternative structures, either macro or regional? Perhaps a kind of authoritarian capitalist logic is emerging that would be a contrary logic. And in this kind of set of questions, you immediately confront a debate with different terms that are used: stakeholder, free rider, spoiler, revisionist state. And you're trying to situate China in the context of grand strategies about opposition, resistance, integration, and collaboration. Everyone agrees that the international order is changing. The structure of power is changing. The U.S. is slowly losing its preeminent position. Unipolarity is giving way to perhaps to multipolarity. There certainly is a diffusion of power, which may or may not be the same thing as multipolarity. Power is moving from the north to the south and from the west to the east. All of that, I think, is agreed upon by most people in this discussion. The question is, what will be the nature of the political formation that will come in the wake of shifting power? And here you have a lot of debate, lots of different visions of contestation, of transformation, of new kinds of orders. Somebody I've been debating over the years, Robert Kagan, offers a kind of a stark position where you have autocratic states pitted against democratic states, capitalist democracies against China and others, which might include Russia. Authoritarian states with their own ability to, in this rendering, find a pathway to modernity that doesn't have to take the pathway through liberal democracy, that there's a way of authoritarianism that's resilient, that's able to take advantage of the world capitalist system to grow within the context of that structure and not compromise its political system in the course of growing and integrating. And these kind of conflicts are exacerbated by resource competition, by grievances, a century of humiliation, Russia, its own grievances about the loss of its position. There are more sophisticated positions. David has a very strong, very sophisticated position about the structure, emerging structure that might take shape around China. I've been teaching a course with my dear colleague and friend Aaron Friedberg this year, and we've been debating the rise of China. And in his rendering, there is at least the possibility of thinking of a regional order that would truly be organized around, both in security and economic terms, around China, massive East Asian trade zone, secured by rising Chinese military power and a kind of slow, almost in the Albert Hirschman sense, this is now my story, not my colleague's story, of integration and redeployment of loyalties, of interests, of industrial structures towards China, and the U.S. kind of peels off. And you start to see something that's very different, certainly not connected to the West, not liberal. My argument is a very different one. Those are my foils in many ways. The argument that the U.S. may decline, but the general liberal international order has staying power. That is to say that there's a structure here that is much more deeper and wider and complex and articulated and sunk into the roots of industrial society, advanced societies, and increasingly developing societies that simply won't give way in the face of a rising China. What's striking in my view about liberal internationalism, which for me at the most core basic characteristic, it's openness and rule-based order. Liberal internationalism, openness and rule-based order. It has lots of other characteristics that come and go across the eras, but that's the most basic. That set of logic of order, liberal internationalism, what's striking is its durability. We've seen great upheavals in the international system over the last decade. The emergence of new powers, including China, financial crises, global recession, bitter disputes among U.S. and Europe over American use of military power, yet no real alternative or glimmering of an alternative has yet to be crystallized. On the contrary, the rise of non-Western powers and the growth of what is very important to my argument, economic and security interdependence, are creating new demands for liberal-oriented international and regional cooperation. So a big part of my argument is this characterization of the complex, this thing that in some ways doesn't even have a name. It's not the West, it's this, call it OECD world, or Greater Industria, or Pax Democratica, or whatever, the Philadelphian system. There's a kind of fully unlabeled complex where the U.S. is clearly at the center, that is a structure that is alive and well and growing almost like an organism. It's easy to join, it's hard to overturn. It's based on more than just American power and the externalization of American ideas. It's longer in the making. It has at least two projects that have pushed it forward. The Westphalian project, which obviously goes back to the 1600s, the rise of state sovereignty, norms of sovereignty, of state sovereignty, non-intervention, self-determination, non-discrimination, being articulated and renewed and refined over the centuries with great powers, and after wars creating ever denser set of norms and practices about how great powers should operate. And then the liberal ascendancy, a 200-year project that really begins in the early 1800s with the rise of liberal democracies from weakness and peripheral status to dominance over the last 2 centuries, pushing aside along the way fascist and autocratic and state communist, state socialist kinds of alternatives. So there's a kind of big argument about that structure that even a dynamic China will find it difficult to offer a crisp, clear alternative to. And my argument goes beyond that. It's not just structure, it's more situational arguments about China and its logic of interests and constraints as it rises in the context of what I've just described. A couple arguments I'll just tick off. China gains from the existing system. Its growth, the reason why we're talking about China as a rising power is that it's in the system, gaining from being in the system. Trade and investment, openness, the trade system, joining the WTO, features that are desirable from a Chinese perspective. The WTO, moreover, type protections can help China as it grows. As growing states confront protectionism, discrimination, there are tools to deal with that problem, protections that China can draw upon, just as the Westphalian system with its norms of sovereignty provide tools and norms for China to draw upon as it faces all sorts of different challenges going forward. So the liberal ascendancy, the Westphalian system have given China a system that has opportunities and possibilities. These opportunities are ones that go beyond that. These are the kinds of institutions that are a part of this order have elevators in them. You can get in on the ground floor and go up to the top. It's called paying for greater stakeholder access for voting shares. IMF, World Bank, and of course the UN, it's been there all along. There really is, secondly, second bullet point, no alternative to this global organizational logic. Some think that China has hatching a kind of a different alternative, a kind of Beijing consensus, but I don't think it's sustainable. It's possible for China to use it in a kind of predatory spoiler role, but elevated to the level of a logic for the system where everybody is engaged in it, everybody loses, and the system becomes less attractive to everybody. So I don't think there's an alternative, although there's a possibility that China could be a spoiler with 1 foot in and 1 foot out. But if it's that kind of China, then it will face not just the United States, but it will face, as it did recently, countries like Brazil, who would in many ways want to affiliate with China and along with India as a kind of non-Western developing country coalition, but finds itself very concerned about the way China behaves in various ways, the currency policy being one of them. Thirdly, rising states will have another reason, China among them, for embracing this system, and it has to do with tools that allow it to signal restraint to neighbors. China found out about this big time last year. 2010 will be a very important year for China and its encounter with the global system, because it found that certain behaviors create reactions, and those reactions are ones that China doesn't want to trigger. Whether it's the reaction in the South China Sea and ASEAN, Hillary Clinton making her performance on the global stage in this regard, whether it's the fishing dispute, territorial dispute with Japan, whether it's the way in which Korea has found itself returning, if you will, to a conception of Korean interests associated with alliances. What we call this, what diplomatic historians who studied post-Bismarck Germany call this, is a policy of self-encirclement. Countries don't want to do that. And when you want to grow peacefully, you will want to find ways, as Bismarck did, and I think as the US did after World War II, to signal that while there are disparities of power, there are also restraints and commitments that are signaled through integration in institutions. And China has a powerful interest to do this, whether it's through regional institutions or global institutions. Final point about the structure that China faces, and it's a more optimistic one or more positive argument about cooperation. Two of the great movements of the modern era, the kind of world historical movements, are the rise of economic interdependence and security interdependence. We know about economic interdependence. Security interdependence means that your security is increasingly tied to what other countries do. You can't be secure alone. You can only be secure together. You have to cooperate. This was nuclear deterrence. It's a form of security cooperation. I have to convince you that you should not launch missiles at me, because if you do, there will be a retaliation. But what security interdependence means today increasingly is not about nuclear weapons. It's about health pandemics. It's about global warming. It's about other transnational issues, security, energy security, that require collaboration. China has a whole set of agenda items that it shares with the United States that suggest that it will want to not challenge as much as take advantage of the kind of liberal international frameworks to secure its own interests. As it rises, as it wants to secure its interests, as it wants to project more authority on the global stage, it will find the institutions that exist part of the toolkit that it wants to use, which is another way of saying, to summarize my argument yet again, that the pathway to leadership and authority for China in the 21st century goes through rather than around the institutions that have been built over the last 60 years. Final point for now. There are three, in my view, I'm working on this argument, there are three ways in which China and the US, or China and the outside liberal order, can rub up against each other and clash. One way is realist conflict. China gets more powerful, it has a bigger navy, it wants to push the US out of the South China Sea, it wants maritime control, and there will be a realist struggle. We know all about that kind of thing. We know it's a problem, it's going to be a problem, we can't hide from it, it's going to be messy, but we do have Westphalian project ideas for how you manage that. The second kind of bumping and clashing is what we'll call a struggle over authority. China will want to have more authority, seat at the table. It wants to be at the high table. So will India, so will Brazil, many other countries. This will require Europe and the United States to give way on authority, the distribution of rights and privileges, but rights and privileges within the existing system. So this is another kind of struggle that will be not insignificant, but it's not the kind of catastrophic system change kind of vision. The third kind of struggle is over the basic principles of international order, the basic foundational principles. Who commands? Who benefits? What are the rules? What is the basic operating logic? And here I see no evidence that China has any idea about alternative grand ideas for organizing the international system. The big news of the 21st century is that this will be a non-debate, that we always have this idea that China's going to rise up and there'll be a kind of drum roll and a little box will open and a little piece of paper will have Chinese conception of international order that will be used to do what the US did after the 1940s. And the paper is going to be, nothing's going to be written on the paper. It will be an empty piece of paper in what I guess you'll call an empty box. I'm being provocative, but I think that the real struggles are over power competition, which we know a lot about, and over authority distribution, which will be a problem because the US has had this privileged position, and it's going to have to make way and develop new habits of cooperation. Think of it as a world that, if I just have 30 seconds, a world that has been a kind of American-run system, America Incorporated, being transformed into WorldCo, where the company goes public. China becomes a shareholder, becomes a member of the board of directors. It's a new governance structure, but it's a company that we can see, and it looks more familiar to us than not.